afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Introductory Qualitative Research Methods. This webinar will run for 1 hour. All attendees on the webinar are muted except for the webinar facilitator and our presenters. If at any point during the webinar you have a question, please type it into the chat box out on the lower left-hand side of your screen, and please keep your questions short and ideally to no more than 20 to 25 words. Your questions will be answered to the extent that time permits during the question and answer portion of the webinar. I will follow up with all the webinar attendees after the webinar to share today's slides and to link to SPSSI's webinar or YouTube channel where a recording of today's webinar will be posted. Today's webinar is being sponsored by the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, also known as SPSSI, and has been organized by SPSSI's Graduate Student Committee, which runs both a policy-focused webinar series and a methodology-focused webinar series like today. I'm Cindy Lucas, SPSSI's Communications Director. I will now turn the webinar over to Megan George, who is also a member of SPSSI's Graduate Student Committee. Megan will be serving as today's webinar facilitator.
Thanks so much, Cindy. Hello and welcome everyone to SPSSI's Methodology webinar series. So today we'll be hearing from two PhD students from York University in Toronto, Alicia Salerno and Kashmala Kasim. Now before turning it over to our presenters, I just want to give everyone a bit of background information about who we are as an organization. So the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues, aka SPSSI, is a community of over 3,000 scientists and researchers. Our members are interested in the psychological aspects of both social and policy issues. Since being founded in 1936, SPSSI aims to bring theory and practice into focus on human problems of groups, communities, and nations, as well as issues that defy national boundaries. Now, although SPSSI is an independent society, we do operate as Division 9 of the American Psychological Association and as an organizational affiliate of the American Psychological Society. Now, if anybody watching today is a non-member and is interested in joining, we are happy to welcome new members to SPSSI, so do check out our website for more information. I also want to take a quick second to mention some of the opportunities that SPSSI offers. We're currently preparing for our summer conference taking place in Pittsburgh this year from June 29th to July 1st. Registration is currently open, and if you are interested in attending, it's not too late to get the early bird rate, so do check that out before May 17th to save. Also be sure to take a look at the pre-conferences because we've got a great lineup of speakers scheduled for this year. So in addition to offering an intellectual home, networking opportunities, conferences, awards, and fellowships, we also do have a peer mentoring program, both a policy and a methodology webinar series, writing opportunities in our graduate student newsletter, The Rookie, and a lot more opportunities. And all of these aim to support graduate students in their scholarly and policy-related pursuits. So don't forget to check out all of our social media platforms for this information. We have a website, a Facebook page, and a Twitter page. So all of this information can be found there. So there is our website. As Cindy mentioned, if you do have any questions, you will be asked to type them into the question portion of the toolbar. So to avoid noise interference, you'll all be muted throughout, but we do encourage you to ask questions and to make comments. The questions will be collected throughout the presentation, and I will be posing those to the presenters at the closing of the presentation. But today's webinar is actually a little bit interactive, more so than we've usually done. So our host will be posing a few questions to you, the audience. So again, responses can be typed into the comment box, and they'll be read and discussed. So finally, the presentation, both the slides and the talk, will be available shortly after the webinar, both via SPSSI's website and our YouTube channel. So we will post the digital versions to our Facebook pages and Twitter feeds once they're available, so keep an eye out for all of those. So now to our main event. We're very excited to have Alicia and Kashmala with us today to talk about qualitative analyses. They've prepared their own introductions, so I will just go ahead and hand it over to our hosts.
All right. Just give us a second to get everything working here. All right. Can everyone hear us? Can't see our webcam. Oh, okay. Sorry, just trying to set this up. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Apologize for my voice. It's been gone for about 2 weeks now because Noel is also a little bit sick. So it might be a little difficult to understand us today. Hopefully not. So thanks for being here this afternoon. We're just going to move right into introductions. So my name is Alicia, and I'm a first-year PhD student at York University. My research mainly focuses on the forensic implications of developmental disabilities. Mostly, I've been doing some research on individual disabilities and their interactions with the police. I've also just wrapped up data collection on a study with a colleague of mine on stranger-perpetrated sexual harassment. Just to tell you a little bit about how I got involved in qualitative methods, I feel like I've always been a closeted qualitative methods lover. But I had a chance to take a class last year, and that's where I really fell in love with qualitative research. So I actually jumped right into it for my master's thesis, which I just wrapped up this past summer.
So my name is Kashmala, and similar to Alicia, we had taken that course together on qualitative research. But before I get into that, I just want to just briefly outline some of my research interests. So I'm looking at conducting interviews with imams in a Toronto Muslim community to see their counseling practices and how spirituality and counseling from a psychotherapeutic lens are being combined from a cultural perspective as well. And I'm also currently running focus groups with Syrian refugees who have arrived in Toronto to see whether they are using religion or spirituality as a coping mechanism for financial threat as they're resettling in Toronto. And I guess sort of where I started my interest in qualitative work was when I was writing a proposal for CIHR for one of the grants. And we realized, my supervisor and I, that the questions that I was asking were just going to be very difficult to answer by just using numbers or standardized skills. Not to bash on quantitative research, but just the questions that I was interested in, they would just be better answered with a qualitative framework. So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Okay, so this webinar is going to provide you with a brief introduction and overview of qualitative research. So we're going to start by just talking about some of the fundamentals, and then we're going to move on to qualitative data collection. So I'm going to talk about interviews, as that is mainly my experience, and then I'm going to turn to Kashmala, who's going to talk to you about focus groups, some of the challenges and costs associated with qualitative methods, and then she's going to lead an interactive group data analysis. Okay, just making sure that everyone can see me because I can't see my webcam. There we go. All right, so before we start, this is meant to be an interactive webinar. So we do encourage you to participate and ask questions throughout the session. So I just want to start off by kind of getting thinking about the value of qualitative research methods. So I just want to think about what is one research question that would be difficult to answer with quantitative methods alone. Be happy to see if anybody has any ideas or has thought about this before. Yeah, you can type your answers into the chat box. Okay. So here at York University, we have been experiencing a strike over the past 7 weeks. So one of the things I've been thinking about is how undergraduates have been coping with faculty strikes. So that, for example, would be one question that you could potentially answer with quantitative methods, possibly if you're choosing scales, but it would be a lot more rich if you were to also use qualitative methods. Yeah. Okay, So what exactly is qualitative data analysis? So Braun and Clark, who are known for their work on thematic analysis, define qualitative analysis as putting an organizing framework on the messiness of real life. So it actually allows you to explore a phenomenon in depth. It yields rich, complex data. It involves interpretation rather than analysis, like you would do in quantitative methods. And typically you're generating meaning rather than numbers. And of course, in qualitative data, the outputs would include detailed descriptions and illustrative examples rather than statistical analyses or results. So I think this cartoon does a really great example of illustrating the difference between quantitative and qualitative methods. So as you can see here, a quantitative researcher might be interested in how many people take a free ice cream when offered. So you can see here, it's interesting to them that only 1 in 30 would take a free ice cream. Whereas a qualitative researcher might be interested in what the individual felt when they first saw the free ice cream. The great thing about qualitative methods is that they can actually complement quantitative methods, which is something we don't talk about a lot. So just for an example, using qualitative methods might give us an idea as to why only 1 in 30 people take a free ice cream. Okay, so we're just going to jump into some of the fundamentals, which includes kind of the basis of knowledge, and then moving towards reflexivity, and then we're going to talk about some of the data collection methods. Okay, so one thing we often don't think about is where knowledge actually comes from. So in qualitative work, it's really important to understand this because it informs how we approach our data. So I'll start with ontology. So ontology is concerned with the nature of reality. This might sound really loaded, but I'm going to try to simplify it. I know it was really confusing when I first learned it, and I was very surprised. I had never really learned it before. So ontology is concerned with what is the nature of reality and what can we know. And it sits on a spectrum that ranges from realism, which states that there is an external reality that exists, so independent of our beliefs or understandings. So you can think of it as almost like there is a true objective reality that we can try to know. So on the other side of the spectrum, we have relativism. And relativism posits that there's not one objective or shared reality, but rather there's multiple different constructions of the social world. Epistemology is concerned with ways of knowing. So more simply put, how can we know or find out about the social world? This is more you can think of along the lines of kind of methods. So on one hand, we have positivism. So positivism assumes that there are objective facts that we can learn about the universe, and we can learn these through typical methods, such as our senses, like observing. So positivism assumes that research and the research process is not affected by the researcher or their values. So in other words, positivism believes that you could potentially have an objective, value-free inquiry into a research topic where you're not affecting it in any way. So on the opposite end is interpretivism, constructionism. So in this end, they don't believe that there is an objective reality, but rather that reality is constructed through the meanings that individuals create. So on this end, they believe the opposite. So researchers definitely affect the research process even if they don't intend to. So therefore, research can never be truly objective and value-free. Oh, sorry, yeah. There we go. Okay, so if you probably figured out by now, quantitative work is more based on the left side of the spectrum, while qualitative work is more based on the right. So therefore, any qualitative research really, you need an acknowledgement that we as researchers have an effect on the research process. And we affect it through the research questions we choose, through the questions we choose to put in our survey, through the measures we choose, and even through the analyses we run and how we interpret our results. So I know when I first learned this, I was pretty surprised because when I actually thought about it, I thought it was kind of strange to assume that we could ever be objective or that we don't affect our research, because even when we're using typical quantitative measures, we're still choosing the analyses, we're choosing the research questions, we're choosing the scales. So I think this is good practice to think about this even in the realm of quantitative methods as well. And that brings us to reflexivity. So reflexivity is another fundamental of qualitative research. And what it does is it addresses this issue that we as researchers have a role and influence on the research process. So you can think of reflexivity as an attitude. So it's acknowledging that we as researchers have an effect, accepting that, and then trying to determine where we could have potentially introduced any sources of biases into our own work. So reflexivity involves critically self-reflecting on your biases and theoretical predispositions. So often you would do this before, during, and after your qualitative methods, kind of deciding whether you're a relativist, whether you're a realist, whether you come from a positivist background. So that's the first thing, is deciding where you're coming from as a researcher. What are your biases in this work? What do you already know about this work? The second, as I mentioned earlier, is acknowledging that you, as a researcher, you're actually a part of the research process. And the last part of reflexivity, it's really a critical inspection of your research process, because it makes you think about where you could have potentially introduced bias into the research process. So it is very much a practice.
I just want to add something to what Alicia had just talked about in terms of reflexivity and also subjectivity, which we'll get into a little bit later. So I was always interested in looking at mental health practices from a cultural lens. And whenever I would present my data, I would talk about things like, oh, in South Asian culture or in Eastern culture, and then just sort of remove that culture from myself. And I'm also from a South Asian background, but I would always just say, like, I'm the researcher and they are the participants. And once during a presentation, I mentioned psychosomatic symptoms, and that how primarily in South Asian culture, individuals do tend to sort of report mental illnesses, for example, anxiety or stress, from a bodily perspective. So they'll say things like, I have a headache, instead of saying I'm feeling anxious, or they'll have stomach pains instead of saying I'm feeling stressed out. So my supervisor, she corrected me right away, saying that, how do you know that headache is not real, or that stomach ache is not real? So this is just something to think about, that we're coming from a very sort of scientific medical model that's created by a certain culture, and we're superimposing that on another culture and thinking that perhaps their experiences and shared and lived experiences are not valid and are not real. So just reflecting, that was a big lesson for myself as well.
Absolutely. All right. So there are many different types of qualitative research methods, and you could really dedicate an entire course to every single method. So for the purposes of this webinar, because it is pretty brief, we are going to focus on grounded theory. But I just want you to keep in mind that there are many different types of qualitative research, and grounded theory might not be suited for your work, but perhaps discourse analysis, phenomenological. I do encourage you to look at some of the resources we have on our resource slide at the end of this and explore this further. So qualitative data collection often looks really different than quantitative data collection, because there are typically no numbers involved. So there are many ways to collect qualitative data, but some of the more commonly known ones are interviews, focus groups, and surveys through open-ended questions. Now, again, this is certainly not an exhaustive list of qualitative data collection, but for the purposes of the webinar, we are going to focus on the first two. So I'm going to talk to you about interviews, as that is mainly my experience, and then I'm going to turn to Kashpala, who's going to talk to you about her experiences with focus groups. Okay, so interviews are one of the most common methods of data collection and qualitative research. So the goal of an interview is to really gain a rich and inclusive account of the participant's experience. Sorry. So what's really important when you're doing an interview is you want to focus on the meaning of the participant's experience, not so much on the accuracy of their account. So you really want to focus on what the experience means to them. So typically, a qualitative interview is about 1 hour, but with that being said, often a 1 hour interview is definitely not proper suited to your research question. So depending on the question, you might want to think about having more than one interview, potentially 3. And this actually affords you a lot of benefits. So the first thing it does is it allows you to reflect on the participants' responses, which lets you see if there are any potential gaps that you can further explore, any questions you want to explore further. Another thing it lets you do is it allows the participant to reflect on their experiences, which could potentially generate new responses at the second interview or the third interview. Sorry. Okay. And finally, what it allows you to do is create a rapport between the participant. So obviously over repeated exposures, you're going to have more of a relationship with them, and it could potentially elicit more information. Also, you want to consider that your role and your presence as an interviewer and how well you interview is integral to how this interview is going to go. So you want to think of this as almost like a co-creation, almost like a coordinated dance of sorts. It's very much like an art or a skill form. So how you interview is going to affect the responses the participant gives you. So you want to think of the participant should always remain the author of their own story, obviously, because you're focusing on their experiences and their meaning. But you want to think of yourself as somewhat of a supportive editor. So you want to pay attention, ask follow-up questions, think of yourself as an editor, but allow the participant to still tell their own story. Okay, so when you're selecting participants to interview, you want to remember that in qualitative work, it's quality over quantity. So sample sizes in qualitative work are obviously a lot smaller than in quantitative work, so your overall N is going to be much smaller. It's very typical. For interviews, you really want to adopt what is called a purposive sampling approach. So you want to choose a sample from which the most can be learned. So it's not necessarily choosing a big sample, it's choosing information-rich cases, so those people who have the most experience, and they can provide with the most information, most rich accounts of their experiences. Another thing to remember too is, although you are selecting multiple participants, the goal is not to verify the initial account. You're not trying to confirm or deny something an initial participant said. Think of it as trying to triangulate the experience. So obviously there's different experiences from every person. So you kind of want to see beyond that single viewpoint. You're not looking to verify. So that's a really important thing to remember. You might get caught on something in the beginning, which does happen, but you do want to see beyond that. Okay, so when you're conducting an interview, one of the most important things to remember is that you are there to just sit and listen. You want to fully understand their experiences and, importantly, what the experience means to them. So one of the most difficult parts of qualitative work is definitely not getting entrenched in your own feelings. I mean, qualitative work, we're often dealing with traumatic or sensitive subjects. You have to maintain somewhat of neutrality. And this is, I think, only with practice that you really learn to do this. So Robert Weiss has a really great book, which is in the references page as well. He gives a lot of good advice on kind of the do's and don'ts of interviewing and kind of making you a master of qualitative interviews. Also, something that's really important to remember is this is especially difficult if you are also a clinician or a therapist or a counselor. You don't want to confound your role of interviewer with any other of these roles. So actually, during an interview, you have to remain neutral. You shouldn't be giving any kind of advice to the participant. And this can be really hard because often we give, I guess I would call it advice in disguise. So one example would be, instead of saying something like, "I'm sure things will get better." So that is obviously comfort. You're trying to comfort the participant. You shouldn't be doing this in an interview role. So rather than that, try something like, "That sounds like it would be a difficult time for you." Robert Weiss addresses this in chapter 5 of his book. He gives a lot of great examples of what not to do.
Yeah, that was a really great point, Alicia, you mentioned in terms of for those of us who are wearing sort of different hats in terms of being in clinical psychology or being in counseling. So I'm not a licensed counselor by any means, but I've just been trained a little bit in pastoral and spiritual counseling. And I remember my first qualitative research interview with Syrian refugees and who clearly experienced trauma in Syria, and they've sort of come here. So I had to be super careful not to apply sort of the counseling principles, and the 4 things that we go off of are empathy, validation, creating a safe space, and having a non-judgmental attitude, which can be applied, I think, to a qualitative research interview as well, but not being overly empathetic and not sort of getting into the emotions and the feelings of the person, which can be quite difficult because you know your participant has gone through a tough time and you do sort of want to be there as a comfort. So what we did just to sort of balance that was I had actually a licensed counselor with me at the place where I was interviewing. So if there were any emotional triggers while they were answering the questions, I would just sort of say, like, after the interview is done, we do have a counselor or a psychotherapist on site, so you can talk to her. So that's just one way if you are having a difficult time and you have this need just to help the person or to comfort them because of your training in other fields in psychology as well.
I think that's a really great point. So actually, when I was conducting interviews for my master's thesis, so I was looking at essentially police interactions with people with developmental disabilities. And this is from the perspective of caregivers and also with people with developmental disabilities like autism, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And one really difficult thing, and I think this is common in qualitative work, if you're doing a community-based project, you very might well know a lot of the people that you're interviewing. So you do have a pre-established relationship with them, which is fine as long as you're not confounding that with your role as interviewer. And again, I think this is only something to achieve through practice. And I don't think it's hard to learn to just sit and listen, because I think qualitative work is really interesting in itself. Just listening to somebody talk about their experience is really interesting. It's more learning that not giving advice, not counseling, not trying to comfort them, just letting them know that you're listening. And one thing that I found really helps with this is kind of adopting an active listening approach, which I actually teach some of my students. And what we do there is you repeat back what they said to you, but rephrasing it. So, oh, so this is what you're saying, and then asking follow-up questions based on that. So that's very comforting in itself because the participant feels like they're being heard. So I think there's a lot of value in just learning how to be an active listener if you're planning on conducting interviews as part of any of your work. So I'm going to turn it over to Kajmala now, who's going to talk to you about her experiences with focus groups and then lead an analysis for us. Just position.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about interviews, so I'm going to talk a little bit about focus groups and just sort of the differences and the pros and cons of focus groups as well. So a lot of my work has to do with conducting focus groups of about 6 to 10 people. That's usually the sample size for focus groups. And we don't just conduct one focus group, it's usually 4 focus groups just to ask the same questions with different participants. So in terms of the literature, we do know that the evidence suggests that there is a more comprehensive and rich understanding with one-on-one interviews. However, with focus groups, you're likely to produce responses that conform to sort of norms and social norms, and especially with regards to culturally sensitive topics such as gender roles, different dynamics within a marriage, within a family. There may be some sort of collectivistic responses that you get in focus groups. And the reason that I've chosen focus groups for my work, especially with Syrian refugees, is because they are from a collectivistic culture. They do sort of bounce off ideas off of each other. They've lived in joint family systems. So there's sort of, I just felt that at that time it was a good idea to conduct focus groups. But now the next step of my study is to actually move on to doing interviews, just one-on-one interviews with the participants. Okay, so in terms of just some challenges of qualitative research before we get into sort of the interactive activity, we've talked a lot about the benefits of qualitative research, but we don't want to give you a super rosy picture because there are a lot of challenges as well. So just listed the top 3 over here that I've heard from even my colleagues and supervisors when I've sort of embarked on this journey. So number 1 is sort of the perception within the academic community that qualitative research is not really scientific, it's too wishy-washy, it's too soft of a science, it's not really providing any hardcore results or numbers. So in terms of that, I feel like that is a huge misconception. It is for sure there aren't per se any scales or numbers involved, but qualitative research is still very systematic. So it's not subjective in a sense that you're just sort of picking up random words from random transcripts. There are certain steps that you do follow, and we'll get into that in the interactive activity as well. It is very systematic, and you are coding things systematically as well. And that's where you get the numbers. You can actually code people's or participants' words and sentences in numbers, calculate percentages. If you really want a number at the end, you can still get a number at the end as well. But primarily for qualitative research, your evidence is a participant's quote. So you're using quotations as your data and as your evidence for your theory. Secondly, in terms of analysis, we actually don't call qualitative analysis. The better term is interpretation. So you're always interpreting your data. You're not really analyzing it. And for quantitative research, usually what happens is you collect the data and then after that you analyze it. For qualitative, the analysis or interpretation is always ongoing. So as soon as you finish one focus group or a couple of interviews, you immediately start interpreting that transcript and you start transcribing, translating, whatever is needed. And it's sort of a never-ending process because you might come to it one day and it's sort of, you've come up with a few codes, you come back to a week later, you're feeling different, you have certain emotions as a researcher, something might be happening in your life that's related to your research, and you might come up with different codes. Whereas for quantitative research, if you're looking at your surveys, if 20 people answered strongly agreed to a question, the next day it will still be 20 people answered strongly agreed to a question. For qualitative, those numbers and those sentences can change. Finally, in terms of the data, so again, with the data, we're not looking at numbers, we're looking at stories, words, patterns, even images. For those of us who are doing photography and sort of picture analysis, that's also something very interesting. They don't provide numbers. So you are looking at subjective data, you're looking at people's experiences and their lived experiences, and that is for sure difficult to quantify. The other main challenge of qualitative work, and I guess we're just trying to be as frank as possible, not to scare anybody off of qualitative work, is the cost. So to do a qualitative study, it does cost, I would say, quite a bit more than quantitative work, because for quantitative work, and I've done that for my master's as well, just send out like 100,000 surveys, and just it's not very expensive at all. You can do a lot of it online. For qualitative work, we've done about 6 focus groups so far, and we're looking at quite a bit of money. I'm not going to tell you all the numbers to scare you, but this is actually the budget that I have on the slide is something very similar to the budget that I had for my study. So number 1 was translation. Many times when you are working with a community sample, and I was working with Syrian refugees who had recently arrived to Canada, their English, they didn't have any English speaking skills. They were able to write English but not speak it. So they were primarily Arabic speakers, and I don't speak Arabic. So I had to get a translator. So of course she had a cost, and that was for the number of interviews and focus groups that we did. After the translation, we had to translate the Arabic into the English for transcription. So the transcribing is also, of course, a certain cost. And I've listed over here between $110 to $165 an hour, depending on how many voices are in the audio recording. So for a focus group, we have usually 10 voices in an audio recording, so the cost does add up. If you have a one-on-one interview, it is a little bit less as well. And for transcription, you can either do it yourself manually. You can just, there's so many different transcription softwares. You can download one and you can just do it yourself. Or if you're sort of low on time, there are several companies out there that will transcribe for you if you're able to pay what they're asking for. In terms of the hours of transcription, it's not just simply that you can just pause the audio recording and then you type it up and then you start and you pause. That's usually the manual way of doing it. However, it takes about 1 hour of audio recording is equal to 4 hours of transcribing. So if you can imagine about 10 hours of interviews, you can do the math, and just as you can see, the transcription does take quite a bit of time in the process. Finally, we also have things like refreshments. So many times for quantitative work, when you're just giving out surveys online, you don't have to worry about who the people are, and they can just be at home. But we are doing a lot of the work with a community sample. They're coming to us, or we're going into their homes. So we usually take like coffee and cookies for them, because we're working so closely. We're taking an hour of their time. So we do want to provide something of that sort. If they're traveling to our location, we usually provide bus fare as well. So that also adds up to the cost. So just remembering all of this: translation, transcription, refreshments, and transit cost. It all goes into just one qualitative study. And again, we've done only about 4 to 6 focus groups, and the cost for sure is adding up, because we have about 10 people in each focus group as well. So we have about 40 people currently in the study. So we pay each participant as well. I don't think I mentioned that in the budget. So yeah, the actually reimbursing the participants as well. And just from my own experience with focus groups with these Syrian refugees, it was so interesting, the cultural dynamics. So of course, for us, for ethics, we do have to reimburse our participants. But for them, it was actually seen as very offensive to take like money or like a Tim Hortons gift card. And they were just so open just to being there, just to sharing their experiences. And they didn't want anything from us. And many of them just put the reimbursement, the envelope that we gave them, directly into the charity box at the mosque that we were at. So they were just so helpful and just so willing. But of course, on your part, you still do have to reimburse them. Doesn't matter what the cultural ramifications of those are. Okay, so in terms of data analysis, I think Alicia had talked about this earlier as well. So data collection, of course, is several different ways of doing it. There's several frameworks of it as well. In terms of the analysis, again, you can follow different frameworks and different ways of analyzing or interpreting your data. We're focusing primarily on grounded theory today, but just to outline very quickly for you. So we have thematic analysis, which is very interesting. I think all of these are really interesting. So you're essentially identifying recurring themes and patterns in the data. So something that keeps coming up, a word that's continuing to come up, that's something that you would identify in a thematic analysis.
Yeah, I actually speak briefly about that. I did do thematic analysis for my master's thesis. So I was looking, essentially I had participants talk about one police interaction of their choosing, and then I went through that and we coded those for the nature of the interaction. So for example, whether they were a victim, whether they were a perpetrator, whether they were being accused of a crime they didn't commit, and we also looked for the outcome. And I did use a thematic analysis for that approach. So this one's, I think, the closest to quantitative methods in terms of frequencies are important in thematic analysis because you want to look at which themes are most frequently emerging. This is a really good segue into qualitative work if you are coming from quantitative like I was. It's a good place to start.
Another analysis is phenomenological analysis, which is basically a detailed examination of the person's experience and their perception of the experience as well. So a lot of this has to do with just the perception and interpretation of that person's lived experience. It's not according to what the researcher thinks is their experience, not according to theory, but just it's quite subjective on that person or the participant's experience. We also have something called discourse analysis, which is looking more at the language. So when you're actually looking at the transcriptions and when you transcribe your data, looking at the actual words, the sentences, when the paragraph breaks, so you can get really to the linguistics of the transcription. And Alicia had actually done this for one of the courses that we were in together, and she looked at just the number of times the person had said, "I don't know" in their interview. So that was also interesting, just counting the number of times someone's saying "I don't know" or
what it means.
Right, yes, and just what it means essentially by saying that in your sentences. Finally, and we'll get into this in more detail as well, is a grounded theory. This is essentially an inductive strategy for collecting and analyzing data, and the whole purpose of grounded theory is to essentially use the data and using that data to come up with a theory that would represent the data, and we'll get into it in the next slide as well. Okay, so that's sort of the definition of grounded theory. It's a long definition. You can read it yourself as well. It's simply the discovery of emerging patterns in data. So you're looking for patterns, themes, things that are coming up in the data and trying to make sense of it all by using a coding strategy. So grounded theory is actually is a generation of theories from data, and it's not actually owned by any one school or discipline. So you can actually use grounded theory for quantitative work as well as qualitative work. So it's not really just only in qualitative research. You can definitely use it in quantitative research as well. The sort of interesting difference here is that usually we have a theory in mind and we would collect data and analyze data to either support or fail to support that theory. So grounded theory, I would say, is sort of like the opposite of that. They're using data to come up with a theory. So that's a little bit interesting. And you're coming into the research question, into the research without sort of any preconceived notions as to what you will find in the data. And if you are like a curious person, if you feel like you don't want to fit the mold of any particular theory, then grounded theory is definitely for you because you're coming in and you're just open to anything and everything that comes in the data. Okay, so before we get into the sort of interactive activity in which we'll get to sort of practice all of these concepts, I just want to quickly go over the basic concepts of grounded theory and how you would actually analyze a transcript. So I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but for example, you've done a focus group or you've done an interview, and of course you have to audio record that or video as well. So you would essentially transcribe that data. You can translate it if it's in a different language. After you've transcribed the data, you're going to look at the transcription and you're just going to look it over quickly. So you skim over maybe 10, 20 pages for one interview, and then you look at it again and you just sort of make some memos, notes, you sort of just write down your initial impressions of that data. And then you go back to the data and you just look at the transcription again and you read it very, very carefully, sentence by sentence, and you start creating meaning units. So some people create meaning units by breaking down the transcript line by line. So you just put a slash, or you can use a different highlighter, and you basically highlight whatever thought you feel is complete. So any complete train of thought is one meaning unit. So some people do it like this, and some people do it sort of question by question. So there is another, I know my supervisor doesn't like this method. She prefers to have more context. So she does it sort of like whatever the question was, and the answer is one meaning unit. So that's just one way of doing it as well. And a meaning unit could be half a sentence, it could be a full sentence, it could be a paragraph, just whatever you as a researcher thinks is a complete train of thought. The second step is open coding. So essentially you're making categories that are open to revision as they become more and more abstract. So initially your codes will be whatever the participant has said, and you'll see in the transcript later on that I've provided. For example, a participant might say with the Syrian context that thank God we were brought to Canada. So thank God we were brought to Canada could be one meaning unit, or thank God could be one meaning unit, brought to Canada is a second meaning unit. So again, it's up to you what you think is a complete train of thought. And the code over there could be thank God. You just use the participant's own words. Like you don't have to put in your own words. Thank God is pretty self-explanatory and it makes sense. We were brought to Canada. You could put in your own words. You could make a code, for example, migration or refugee. So that could be a code as well. And generally the codes are quite concrete initially. And as we combine them and we compare and contrast the codes, they become more and more abstract until you come up with a theme for that code. The third step is constant comparison. So throughout the analysis, the interpretation, you're comparing and contrasting different categories and different codes. So for example, how is shame different from guilt? So a participant might mention something like, I felt so ashamed leaving my family, and I feel so guilty that I'm not able to send money back to Syria. So how are shame and guilt same, and how are they different? Throughout the interpretation process, you're also memoing at the same time, which I think is super important in qualitative work. I think we don't do it as much in quantitative. So you have theoretical memos. So that's where you've done the literature review. You sort of know what the literature looks like. And you're just sort of jotting down your ideas of which theory this could fit into or how this could advance a theory that already exists. Some quantitative researchers disagree with this whole theoretical memo part. They say that you should not have any idea of the literature. So I know my supervisor, she also feels that don't look at the literature, don't do a systematic review, just interview, just interview participants, do focus groups, and let them be your guide to what literature you will look at later. This is also very different from quantitative work where you usually do a systematic review, a literature review, you write a proposal, and then you sort of know what you're looking for in your data. The fifth thing is personal memos, and this is where you're jotting down your own thoughts and subjectivity during an interview or a focus group. So for me, I think just like a sort of a self-revelation for me, I was interviewing Muslim Syrian refugees, and I'm Muslim myself, so I was jotting down sort of just religious things that were coming up for me and just sort of putting it out there, because we're not trying to hide anything as qualitative researchers. You just put down your subjectivity, it's just there for everyone to see and for you to reflect on as well. And finally, the last concept is saturation. That's basically when your interviews or focus groups are not generating any new data and you're not able to create any new categories. And this is when data collection stops. So there is no power analysis per se. It's just sort of when you, for example, we've done 4 focus groups with the Syrian refugees and we're finding the same answers come up over and over again. So I think we'll probably do maybe 1 or 2 focus groups more, and then we'll probably end it at that time. So Alicia talked a little bit earlier about reflexivity and also subjectivity, and just thinking about how you as a researcher can influence the research project. So what are your theoretical predispositions? Are you of the same cultural or religious background that may sort of insert some biases into the way you're asking the questions, the way you're conducting the focus group? And just the main thing is that we can't say, okay, we're not going to be subjective, we'll be totally objective. I won't let my biases come in. That is not possible. We're human beings. Our participants are humans. The main thing is that you're documenting your perspectives and biases. So as long as you've jotted them down, you've sort of affirmed them, you've validated them, that's sort of the more important step in qualitative work. It's not about ignoring it or just disregarding our subjectivity, because we all do have them. And of course, we have peer review, of course, in qualitative work as well. So other people are reading, looking at your work, and they can see what the biases may have been while you were conducting the interview or while you were analyzing your data. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention before we try the activity together is some software that's available for qualitative work. So there's NVivo and there's also Atlas TI. So I've used Atlas TI a little bit for my work. And it's just, these softwares are just really nice because they get all of your data, all of your transcriptions into one sort of file. Everything comes up, whether it's PDF files, Word documents, Google documents, whatever you have, audio files, video files, they all come together, and you can essentially code them just using the software. So usually we would code them manually, so I would just get like highlighters and sticky notes, and that's one way of doing it, but you could just use a software like this, and they'll let you do open coding, they'll let you make meeting units, you can do in vivo coding. There's a lot of technical stuff that's available in these software, so if you're more of a tech geek, then this is definitely for you, but if you prefer doing it manually, you can just print out your transcripts and just use highlighters and sticky notes, and that's one way to analyze the data as well. Okay, so if everyone is ready to start this sort of interactive activity, I know it's a little bit hard because I can't see you, but you can see me. I'm going to just present you a portion of the transcript that is from my research study, and there's no names or anything mentioned, so it's all confidential. So what I want you to do is first divide that transcript, it's just like a small portion, into meeting units by putting a slash after every complete thought. So what you think is a complete thought. Then you can come up with a concrete name for the main idea or the main theme that defines that meeting unit, and define each category as well. And this will make more sense as we get to the actual activity. And then we're going to combine the meeting units and categories, and then we'll try and come up with a more abstract name that encompasses the 2 or 3 categories to have a higher order category. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of context for this transcript, so this is when I was using focus groups, just to understand the collectivistic nature of moving to a new country and adapting to a new culture. So this transcript is from one of the focus groups that we did with Muslim Syrian refugees at the Islamic Institute of Toronto. It's a mosque located in Scarborough. And I had an Arabic-speaking translator present with me, so it was audio recorded, and then she helped me to translate and transcribe the data as well. And before starting the focus groups, I had asked the participants to sort of complete a short demographic quantitative questionnaire. So this is where sort of qualitative and quantitative come together. You can always insert a scale or demographic questionnaire before you go into your qualitative work as well. So some sample questions that I asked my participants were, there's about 12 of those, I'm just presenting a sample here. How was your experience moving to Canada? How do you find living in Toronto? What were your expectations? What are some challenges that you faced? Now that you are here, do you have enough to meet your needs? And how are you coping with your current financial situation as you are resettling in Toronto? So just some samples, some sort of easy starter up questions. And for focus groups, you always want to start off a little bit easy and then go into the more difficult questions near the middle of the focus group as well. Okay, so here is the sample transcript. So the way we transcribe is verbatim. So just word for word. We don't take out anything. We don't correct any grammatical errors, nothing like that. All the commas, everything. We just leave it as is. So this was one of the participants. She was in her mid-30s and she had completed a grade 10 education. So I'll just read the transcript because I think it's just important to read it out loud, and then you can sort of figure out where you think the meeting units should be for each one. Well, now in regard with religion, thank God. Those devoted to God, God will find ways for them to overcome difficulties, meaning thank God. We have faith in God and are dependent on Him. And when we left Jordan, for me personally, the moment I got on the airplane, I thought I'll consider this migration for the sake of God, meaning we are forced migrants. We were forced to flee. Thank God we were dependent on Him and He didn't let us down. And she smiled with contentment and she continued, thank God we found services. I mean, the most important thing is that when we got to Canada, we found all hands open for us, welcoming and from all communities, Muslim and non-Muslims from all countries. Okay, so we're sort of letting you know the meeting units that we came up with and sort of what we thought was a complete train of thought. And again, this may be different to what you might think a meeting unit is. So each meeting unit is divided into a different color. So the red is one, the green is the second one, and blue is the third one. So I put down the first part, that thanking God, devotion to God, overcoming difficulties with the help of God, dependence on God. I think just God was like the main sort of code and category there. So that was the first meeting unit for me. And I've done this activity with other people as well. And for some people, they say, in regard to religion, thank God. And that's one unit. Devotion is a second unit. Overcoming difficulties is a third unit. and dependency is a fourth unit. So that is another way of putting the meaning units. So again, it is quite subjective at this stage, but that doesn't mean qualitative research is subjective. It is all wishy-washy. There is systematic analysis that will come later on. The second unit, meeting unit, is in green. So this is when the participant is talking about going on the plane. This is the migration part, essentially. This is what I see when she's talking about fleeing, forced to flee. She uses the word migrant, migration, forced migration. So I thought all of that would be one meeting unit. It's one complete train of thought. And finally, the last one in blue, I thought was a separate meeting unit because this was more not about God, but more about people. So sort of the creator versus creation dichotomy. So just looking at the people, that Canadians were open and they were welcoming. So that was sort of a separate thought in my head, at least. Okay, so I've created a sort of like a word cloud, you can say, of lower order categories. So if you take the entire transcript, the meeting units and everything, what are some categories that come to your mind? So maybe some words like migration, thank God, forced to flee, welcoming hands, open hands. All of these words, at least for me, came to my mind. I'm sure some of these came up for you as well. And this is, again, I read this transcript like 20 times before, so you're probably reading this the first time, of course, so it will be quite a bit different. So this is actually a lot of the words that I've come up with are because I've read the transcript quite a few times as well. Okay, so after you come up with the lower order categories, you have to define those categories as well. So I've just picked 3 over here. I have like 20 or 30 different categories. I've just listed 3. So forced to flee is one category that came up for me. So that just basically means that she did not have a choice to migrate to a new country. There were certain factors in Syria that sort of impacted that decision. And again, I'm not going to assume what the factors were. Maybe it wasn't the conflict. Maybe it was some other reason that she had to migrate, but we're just going to leave it open and just say that she was forced. The other category I came up with was thank God, and I defined it as gratitude plus reliance and resilience, essentially. So relying on your faith that if God put you to the test, then he will also get you through the test as well. And finally, all hands open. So I defined this as that the participant did not feel any discrimination upon arrival in Canada. And this is where our theoretical memos come in, that the literature shows that refugees, if you have like a honeymoon phase, so to say, that initially they'll feel that everything is great, and Canadians are so welcoming, there's no racism here. And that does happen initially for the first year or so, and then that sort of wears off. Okay, so after you have the lower categories, you define the lower categories, then you come up with a higher order category. So the higher order category essentially is a little bit more abstract, and you combine maybe 1 or 2 or even 2 or 3 lower order categories. So like ones that I had come up with are thank God and thank people. I think that really nicely summarizes thanking God and having faith in God, and thanking people like for essentially accepting them into a new country. I also came up with religion and spirituality, so sort of the institution of religion, so the mosque as a support system versus your own faith, which is sort of in your heart, in your soul, so just spirituality was something different. So that's just some of the, I'm not getting into the other 2 categories for the interest of time, but they're just some of the higher order categories that we came up with. Okay, so last few things I want to mention before we end off is when you are done all of this stuff, when you're written up your report, and of course, if you're looking for publications and you're presenting at conferences, to also remember knowledge translation. So ethical guidelines for community-based research, it does require us to give back information to the community, not merely just use them as research participants. So for example, for my research, I'm actually going back to the same mosque, and I have to conduct a workshop on managing finances and budgeting, especially for Syrian refugees, as they're sort of learning everything in Canada, the banking system, the bus system. So we're going to do a workshop for them. So you can do workshops, you can do trainings, you can create a play, create brochures, but just translate that knowledge in some sort of a creative way. And I mentioned that you could, of course, go to a conference and publish, which is the norm in quantitative work. But for qualitative research, there are other options. And I have seen personally people, academics, they've done spoken word, poetry, they've gone on YouTube and Instagram and presented their qualitative work in that way as well. You can use social media. You could even write up a graphic novel. And the final one, which is my favorite, I think, is participatory research, in which you are using your, or sorry, not using, I don't know that word, but you're asking your participants, you're requesting them to present the data in their own words. So if they can just come in and in Arabic present their quotes, I think that's the most sort of magical and most creative way of presenting qualitative work.
All right, so I think that brings us to the end of our content. Sorry, I'm trying to see what it was. All right, so we do have some suggested readings here, so you can take a look at these. These are focusing on thematic analysis, grounded theory, because I just take a look. If you're interested, you can email us. We can actually send you some of these references.
Okay, and we've sort of just ended off with The Future Looks Good. One of my, all my participants, actually, the Syrian refugees, they would always say after like every paragraph, after every sentence, the future looks good, like all this has happened, but the future looks good. So we hope that for qualitative research also, that the future looks good, and there has been an increase in interest in qualitative work. So we're hoping that this also has intrigued where it does look optimistic. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, both of you. Really interesting stuff. And just to add to the popularity of qualitative work, this has been a really popular webinar. So thank you all for all of those of you who have attended. Hopefully you got some good information out of it. We have a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to relay some of the questions that our audience have for you. So to begin with, how many sessions do you typically conduct for focus groups or your interviews?
Sessions as in?
I would imagine that would mean if you were conducting like how many focus groups with different people versus how many focus groups with the same people. Would you require multiple interviews with the same person? Basically, how do you determine how many, to use quantitative terms, how do you decide your end beforehand in terms of running focus groups, especially because I think those require you to sort of do a little more organizing beforehand?
Sure. So for focus groups, there are actually two approaches. So one approach is that you actually don't have an estimated end, so you let the data just guide you. That's sort of my supervisor's advice as well. And others, of course, they do prefer a more structured approach. So they'll say something like, do we want 40 people or 50 people? So about we'll run 5 focus groups with 10 people. And if we don't reach saturation, so if the responses are still very varied and they're different, then we will continue running the focus groups. The way I'm doing it is that I'm just running 2 at a time. So I'll do one for men, one for women. If we feel that, okay, the responses, there's still quite a bit more to learn, we'll run another 2. And then if the responses are still pretty different, we'll run another 2. And then now at about 6 focus groups, we're learning that people are responding in about the same way. So that's where we cut it off, and that's our final end. So it's just, I think the saturation principle really helps. When you don't get any new responses or any new information to make new codes, that's your end.
Yeah, I think with interviews it's similar. Well, if you're doing thematic analysis, you might want to go for a larger number. For my approach was just to recruit and see how many people would participate, and I went based off that. So I really didn't have any issues. I just kind of took as many as I could because I did want to see, obviously people with disabilities are at different levels of the spectrum, so I wanted a very representative group.
And for focus group, I just wanted to add, it was different people in each focus group. So for focus groups,
one session,
yeah, it was one focus group with like 10 people, and then another 10 people would come in for the second one. So it was different, but you could also have the same people as well.
Okay, great. And one other quick question. Unfortunately, we have lots of questions, but we're running out of time. You did mention software, including in vivo, that help sort of, I'm assuming that's with the interpretation and the analysis. Are there any other companies or software available to help with the transcription of the interviews?
For transcribing, actually, I've just gone on to Upwork.com, and essentially you can just outsource your transcription. So there are people who are working internationally, and they just work on contracts. So Upwork.com, that's the one that I have used. And in terms of softwares, I know I've just Googled different ones. I don't have any one particular one that I like, but if you just Google transcription software, or they just sort of have a little plugin you can download onto your browser, you can just use that as well. So I don't have any particular ones. I don't know if you've used any.
Yeah, I just used good old like typing it down.
Yeah, just typing it down. Yeah.
Okay. So unfortunately, it's 2 o'clock. We are out of time. As I mentioned, there are a number of other questions, but if your question wasn't answered, or if you discover you have other questions later, please do feel free to reach out to both Alicia and Kashmala. Again, I would like to thank both of you for such a great talk. It was a really wonderful topic, and it was so nice to have you two share your expertise with us. And also thank you to everyone who attended. This was a really well-attended webinar, so thank you for joining us. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to the SPSSI staff and the Graduate Student Committee. In particular, thank you to Sarah Mankell, our Policy Director, Ashley Weinberg and Angela Robinson, our Graduate Student Committee Chair and Chair-elect, and as well as Cindy Lucas, who you heard from at the beginning, our Communications Director. These are the people involved in conceiving of, coordinating, and promoting this webinar. Just one last reminder, please do check out our social media accounts. You'll be able to watch this presentation again or learn more about future webinars and other opportunities that we offer at SPSSI. Again, please send your questions. I know we didn't get to a lot of them, so please feel free to reach out. And Cindy, is there anything else that you would like to add before we close out?
Just one final reminder for anyone who missed the beginning of the presentation. We'll follow up with a recording of the webinar so that folks can catch it on YouTube. And also, we'll attach the slides so that people have all the information they need to catch the material that was presented here. And thanks to everyone who joined us and the presenters. It was wonderful and lots of questions. So we really appreciate all the participation from everyone. And thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.